Space Tango is not your first foray into completely impossible to succeed biotech ventures. We had some mutual friends in a company in San Diego that was going to revolutionize the artificial skin industry back in the 19-somethings, we'll say. So let's start talking about advanced tissue sciences and the way things looked several decades ago in this field, and the successes we all had then and the mistakes we all made. What were you thinking in so long ago in trying to do what ATS was trying to do?
So I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to share some of the experiences from the early days as well as what we're doing now. And I guess you could say I must like big challenges, right? Because certainly in my career, I've had the opportunity to do some things that people definitely think we're not going to be able to do. And I think that's part of how maybe I have the wherewithal to take on the new challenges that we're working on in space right now. But from a tissue engineering perspective, sure, when we started to think about creating a new market for tissue engineered skin, it was an emerging market, really didn't have anything that existed that looked like it, even how to take it through the FDA, how to think about scaling it up, what the commercialization process looked like, pricing back in those days in the early 90s.
How do you do quality control on a piece of skin? How big were the pieces?
So 4 by 6 inches, but we would grow the equivalent of a football field's worth of skin in our manufacturing facility. So our lots and our batch size was quite large.
And it was never the blockbuster. What went wrong?
Yeah,
we know a lot went right, but what went wrong?
Sure. Well, I think that there was a lot of excitement about the opportunity to end the organ shortage. And one of the things that I talk about often is we're still at that 20-some years later, right? And it, I think, signals how hard what we're doing really is. I mean, even for advanced tissue sciences, it didn't hit the mark necessarily from an analyst perspective in terms of revenues that were generated, but
did you realize you could charge $2 million for a cell and gene therapy back then?
No, and so now that I know that we can do that, if we could rethink that model, but that I think speaks to what's changed, right, in the industry. And one of the things I think that's really amazing is I remember the days when we would talk about the fact that we could never use a patient's own cells because it just wasn't economically feasible from an FDA perspective.
There's still some people who think that, by the way.
From an FDA perspective, it was very challenging in terms of your manufacturing facilities. So the FDA has evolved. I've watched CAR T therapies. The first time I heard about CAR T therapies, I had to sit down because I thought, what's happened in the industry? How can that be? And what I now realize is that if you can provide benefit that is life-saving, if you can cure diseases, people will really work to whatever the constraints are from a manufacturing or pricing perspective to be able to bring those to patients. And I think that's an important thing not to lose sight of when we're talking about how expensive these therapies are and how difficult they are to manufacture. What we did at Advanced Tissue Sciences, I think, laid the foundation for people to start thinking about regenerative medicine. So we may not have ended the organ shortage, but we certainly opened up a field for regenerative medicine, and I think we're watching some of those successes come forward now.
Yeah. If you listen to Bruce Levine's presentation on cars, apart from a very large number of awful puns on the word car, his presentation really reminds us that once upon a time cars were handmade and extremely expensive and really not available to as much of the population as might benefit from them, which of course sounds very familiar when you're talking about CAR T-cell therapies. So moving on to your current venture, which is doing stuff in space. I have a long background in trying to solve cell culture problems, and I don't recall at any point when discussing cell culture problems anyone said to me, if only we could do this in space, it would be so much easier. So what are you thinking? Isn't it hard enough on Earth? I mean, there are plenty of it. You could do it in the desert. You could do it at the bottom of the ocean. There are plenty of difficult places to do cell culture.
So doesn't everyone want to be an astronaut secretly and go to space? I mean, I think so seriously. You know, in my career, obviously I've had some opportunities to do some things that are a little unique, and innovation is a word that everybody uses quite a bit in the industry, and I think I got a little tired of hearing innovation, innovation, innovation. And I heard about someone doing research in microgravity, and I thought, well, that's fascinating. You know, that's a variable that you actually really can't take out here on the ground. And so when I learned a little bit more about research in microgravity, one of the things that really struck me is it is a completely new lens for science. And so when you start thinking about how you look at biological systems and what happens in microgravity, changes that you see in how cells signal or aggregate, or changes in gene expression, to me it became a way to really help the field of regenerative medicine and cell-based therapies to think about advancing, because it's a completely different approach. So you might be able to find a pathway or understand a pathway that you can't necessarily on the ground find an answer to, or new therapeutic options, or manufacturing opportunities, upsides for things like stem cells that grow faster in microgravity but are a little bit delayed in their differentiation. So to me, I think space, although it sounds a little bit, it's probably as crazy as people thinking that CAR T therapy could actually be successful and get people to invest in it.
Do you look at it from just a manufacturing perspective, or do you seek to understand how humans might benefit or suffer from being in space for extended periods? Which I think, you know, even the most pessimistic futurist would have to admit that is somewhere some people are going to spend much more time in the future than in the past.
Absolutely. Well, for us, we really are focused on benefit to life on Earth. So we want to help to advance cures, therapies, product processing for patients here on Earth. But certainly what we're learning really does help NASA in terms of long-duration exploration goals. We have a tissue chip program that we do with the NIH that, in fact, I was mentioning earlier. It's fascinating because we use that to look at human models for disease, and certainly how we can use those for things like drug challenge or understanding biology of a disease. But from a NASA perspective, at some point, you probably see astronaut cells being used to generate those human analogs, whether they're chips or organoids, and flying alongside of astronauts so that you can actually collect cellular data at the same time that you're collecting blood and other samples and heart rates, that you can look at the whole astronaut as well as what's happening at the cellular level. And it is microgravity, being in microgravity, it's kind of an accelerated aging effect that you see. Depression of the immune system, bone loss, muscle wasting, all kinds of phenomena that the stress of being in a microgravity environment produces, which can help us to study things like diseases of aging, but also helps us to find those pathways to help develop countermeasures for astronauts as well.
So, the Apollo program brought us pens that can write upside down. There are unintended benefits, some more real than others. Do you think your first big success will be deliberate or accidental?
Well, that's a very good question. Aren't all the greatest discoveries accidental? I mean, most of what we know, I think it's going to be a combination. To be quite honest with you, I think we know enough about terrestrial understanding of stem cell biology. And as we start to understand what happens in a microgravity environment, I think we're going to have a moment where we might see something in a way that we've never seen it before. You commonly hear astronauts talk about sort of the overview effect, when they look down from space and they see the planet, and how that's just this amazing moment for them. And I tend to think of research in microgravity as being sort of the microgravity effect, when we have that moment where all of a sudden, everything that we know about stem cells on the ground maybe makes sense because of what we just learned in microgravity.
What do you think the first success will be?
For us, so let's just say space is an added challenge. So we talk a lot about the challenges that happen in the regenerative medicine field, but space as it's sort of, has its own complexity. You have to launch on a rocket. You have an astronaut who has to help you get your research into a facility on station that you control from the ground. You have to come back down again in a rocket, and you certainly, have to work right now within the constraints of the NASA process, because we basically fly our payloads in the commercial resupply missions. So every time that supplies are sent up for astronauts, our research can actually be sent up as well, and our pilot scale manufacturing. For us, as we think about what the space economy looks like, mostly every one of you benefit from the space economy right now. I know you probably don't realize that, but every time that you use your cell phone or you go on the internet, most of the space economy is satellites. So but what it uses from 250 miles up is the vantage point. So you're just looking down. You're not actually really using microgravity. When you think about the effect on cells, that's the microgravity effect. And so we really right now rely on things like what happens with physical science in microgravity as well. So our first probably entrance into the manufacturing of products, we work with a group right now that is making a retinal implant, and it's protein polymer based, so it's not cell based, because I think we not only have to help the FDA to understand that we want to manufacture off the planet, but I think we need to stepwise. I know what it's like to take things through the FDA that are a little novel, and so help them in that process of thinking about how we might actually create GMP manufacturing facilities that might necessarily not be here on the ground, but 250 miles overhead. So our retinal implant project that we're working on relies on, in microgravity, you can do very uniform layer deposition. So if you have something that is a product that helps to correct vision, you want it to be as uniform as possible. So we're looking at it from a stepwise approach, but we'd like to move towards stem cell production, vaccine production, monoclonals, vaccines, a variety of different biomedical products.
And what's the timeline here, realistically?
Yep. So, we'd like to think about using that same failure is not an option. So we work on a very aggressive mentality, and as a company, Space Tango is committed to, by mid-2020, having our own orbital platform where we'll be able to do some of this manufacturing. That's an aggressive goal, but
you realize that's this year?
Well, mid-2020s, so mid-2020s of the decade. So, but it's sort of like NASA's goals. They're big, right, as well. NASA, we're going to land people on probably the moon by 2024. That's an aggressive goal. And I think if we set those kinds of goals, then it pushes us that harder to meet them.
Very good. Well, please come back here before the mid-2020s
Absolutely.
With your first commercial success.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much for a glimpse into the future.